Happy Friday. I'm here. I said I would possibly be back, and here I am doing a video on the mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. Now, I should have done this 2 days ago because I just found out that Poe died on October 7th of 1849. It would have been fitting, but I didn't know that until now, so... Nevertheless, here we are, the mysterious deaths of Edgar Allan Poe. What I'm going to do is I'm going to list the 5 mystery theories, and then I'm going to delve into them and give you the goods on it and give you my opinion on whether or not I think they're possible. With that being said, let's get into it. Before we get into it, let me just explain to you something real quick. If you don't know me, if you do know me, Edgar Allan Poe is a big inspiration of mine. One of my favorite writers. I've read The Raven, The Pit and the Pendulum, Mask of the Red Death. I even watched the movies with Vincent Price. They're just classics. Poe is the inspiration for the Macabre Masterpiece books that I've written. So if you happen to come across a copy of the Macabre Masterpiece and you read it, and you kind of get that Poe vibe, that's because, yeah, big inspiration of mine. So, let's get into it. For those who don't know, as I just said, Poe died under mysterious circumstances on October 7th of 1849. He was found delirious in an alleyway, and there's many theories as to how he died. So how did he die? Well, let's get into the possibilities, shall we? The first is alcohol poisoning. The second, poisoned in general. The third, rabies. The fourth, he had a disease. And the fifth is cooping, C-O-O-P-I-N-G. And if you don't know what cooping is, I will explain it when I get to it. That's cooping with a C, not pooping. So, for the love of God. Alright, the first one is alcohol poisoning. This is a widely considered possibility. But I think many people underestimate the reason behind it. Many people think, oh, he died of alcohol poisoning. Poe didn't know how to hold his liquor. Oh, he drank too much liquor. Yes and no, but there's more to it. Poe had a medical condition which prevented him from consuming large quantities of alcohol, to the point that anytime Poe drank, unless it was a little bit, he got sick. So whether or not it was his own doing or somebody was forcing drinks upon him, it suggested that Poe had a medical condition that was known, and alcohol greatly affected this. To the point where if he drank a lot of alcohol, like a ton, he would be delirious in an alleyway and die from it. Video over, right? No, not quite. It's not that simple. This is only a theory. I think it's a very good theory. I think it's a very interesting theory. Excuse me. I think it's a very plausible theory. There's evidence to support it, and it definitely makes sense if you really think about it. The second one, he was poisoned in general. Like, poisoned not by alcohol, but by, like, hemlock, laudanum, whatever crazy poisons they had. 1800s poison, Is this possible? Absolutely. Did Poe have enemies? Yeah, damn right he did. Poe was the type of guy that, he kept to himself, but at the same time he could also be eccentric. Like, you didn't know which version of him you were going to get. And a lot of people back then, it was, like the Western days when, somebody walks into the saloon and they're like, I don't like the way you're looking at me. That was still the case in Baltimore in the 1800s. Poe was a weird-looking guy. He could walk into a bar or an establishment and rub somebody the wrong way simply by looking at them or just speaking, because he was rather dark and eccentric. Could they have poisoned him? Yeah, sure, I think it's possible. You can't rule anything out with, people from the 1800s, or even Poe for that matter. The third one is rabies. You all know what rabies is, right? Rabies is what you get when you're bitten or scratched by an animal. Did Poe have a pet? I have no idea. Did he spend a lot of time in alleyways? Apparently, so I've heard. Either way, Poe contracted rabies because he was bitten or scratched by an animal. If this is the case, if this is how Edgar Allan Poe died, it breaks my heart a little bit to know that one of my greatest inspirations in writing died from a animal bite or scratch. That's silly, right? It's preposterous. But it's not, like a lot of people died from rabies back then. You have to remember that. You have to take that into consideration. Rabies back then was like cancer today. That was like any disease today was, that's how bad rabies was back then, because doctors, doctors were in the 1800s. They couldn't treat things for crap, I edited myself. They couldn't treat things for shit. There I said it. So, to suggest that, Poe had rabies, yeah, absolutely, he definitely could have. And if he didn't treat it, didn't know he had it, or the doctors tried to treat it, whatever, and he died from it, it's absolutely possible. Although, what a way to go. Great writer, and you die from rabies. Can you imagine? Like, imagine getting bitten by, like, a rabbit with rabies and dying. Like, oh, how did he die? How did he go? Oh, he was bitten by a poisonous rabbit. Like, can you imagine? Like, The fourth one is he had a disease. This is another widely popular theory. There's many diseases here. I'm going to read off at least 4 or 5. Delirium, cholera, heart disease, and epilepsy. I've never heard of the epilepsy one. That one's kind of weird for me. Again, I'm not a doctor. I don't need to tell you that I'm not a doctor. You already know that. However, to suggest that Poe had some sort of form of delirium, and again, I'm not a doctor, so I don't know how many forms of delirium are out there. Take my word for it, Poe had some sort of form of delirium. He did. How he contracted that delirium, I don't know. He was a dark and depressed man, 24/7. He definitely demonstrated some form of delirium. Cholera. Isn't cholera like the second disease that you die from in Oregon Trail behind dysentery? I feel like it is. Heart disease, I mean, people died back then from heart disease. People die now from heart disease. How did he die? Heart disease. Oh, alright. Like, to me, heart disease seems like a cop-out at this point compared to alcohol poisoning in general, and rabies, Like, they couldn't figure it out. There's something in his system, but we don't know what it is. But I'm too lazy to figure it out. Let's just say he died of heart disease. You gotta figure that might have happened, because doctors were like, yeah. And again, epilepsy, I've never really heard of that one until I recently came across it. Did he demonstrate signs of epilepsy? I don't really know how that would work, so... But do I think he had a disease and he could have died from it? Yeah, that's definitely possible. I would say that's number 2 behind alcohol poisoning. The last one is cooping. Now, for those who don't know what cooping is, this is a recent theory. When I first heard it, I was like, that seems kind of weird. But then, the more you think about it, the more it kind of sort of makes sense, which is... So cooping is also known as electoral fraud. So basically, back in the day, people voted, just like they do now. But cooping, cooping, not pooping, God, I can't stress that enough. Cooping is when people, they intimidate you and use violence into getting you to vote, to the point where it causes violence and or possibly death. So it's suggested that Poe was near an alleyway that was also near a voting station, and that when these group of men came out and saw Poe, they wanted to know who he was voting for. But since Poe was kind of already delirious or drunk or whatever, they weren't getting anything out of them. So rather than try to get him to, like, rather than leave him alone or get anything out of him, they just beat him up to the point where he probably died. Can you imagine dying because people wanted to know who you voted for and you wouldn't tell them? I mean, today, I probably shouldn't say that, given the fact that the election's like a month around the corner, and yeah, I'll just leave it at that. But back in those days, can you imagine dying because people wanted to know? Like, one of the greatest writers in our world died because of eccentric voters. I know, right? It sounds preposterous, but at the same time, given the time period, it's not that outrageous. Especially if he was wandering near a voting station and he was kind of already out of it, he didn't help. That didn't help matters, you know. So yeah, which ones do I think are possible? Alcohol poisoning. That's my number one. I think that's absolutely possible, just because I think he had that medical condition that went with it. Number two, I would say he had a disease. I think that's relatively number two. Number three, I think he could have been poisoned in general. Number four, I would go with rabies. And then number five, I would go with cooping. Just because it's new. Like, I had never really heard of it until recently, so I gotta put that at number five. How do you think Edgar Allan Poe died? Is it any of these? Is it any that I missed? Perhaps you'd like to share. Let me know. Comment on the video. Or don't, because there's nobody here. DM me. Whatever. You know, I'd love to hear back from you. The mysterious death of Edgar Allan Poe. Again, Poe is just he's a great inspiration of mine. Without him, there would be no Macabre Masterpiece books. I mean, really. So yeah, this has been my latest Mystery Unsolved. Until we meet again.